Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the Museum of the History of Science on this slightly chilly but otherwise beautiful evening. I'm Silke Ackermann, I'm the director, and I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by Nigel Biggar, the Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology and Director of the McDonald Centre for Theology, Ethics and Public Life. Nigel's interests span a huge number of topics, amongst which we find the just war reasoning and the ethics of killing. Liz Bruton on my left, on your right, is the co-curator and researcher of our Heritage Lottery-funded exhibition Harry's Story. Henry Moseley, a scientist lost to war, that was the Heritage Lottery title. Now, of course, it is called Dear Harry, for a very good reason, because we wanted to bring out the human story in it. Tonight, we want to debate a question which has intrigued many people since they've seen the exhibition, which has intrigued us since we started working on the exhibition. And that is the notion, too valuable to die. Now, many of you saw the exhibition tonight. We know that it is a story of promise and achievement, a story of love and loss, the story of the extremely promising but very short life of Henry Moseley, a young scientist who had achieved in his 20s what many of us haven't achieved in a much greater age. And one feels slightly humbled, well, rather humbled by that, and who died with 27 at Gallipoli. So it is also the story of Gallipoli which we wanted to bring to life. There are very few places in the country, actually only one other, where one can engage with the story of Gallipoli. If you haven't been able to see the exhibition tonight, please come back another time. You will have seen outside that we've just extended the run of the exhibition because it has been so hugely popular, both with our wider audience and also with our academic peers. We've just been nominated for the prize of the Royal Historical Society, so please keep your fingers firmly crossed. We're waiting for the outcome. Too valuable to die was the immediate reaction when the knowledge or the news of Harry's death reached people in Britain. But not just in Britain, but also in Germany, in other countries. The very international community which Harry had been part of before the war, which is very matter of fact, as Oxford is nowadays, it was then, the young Rhodes Scholar from Germany working closely with Harry, the outcry, how too valuable to die, how could they, came from all sides. Now, Nigel, too valuable to die. What does that really mean? Too valuable in which way? And are there others who wouldn't be?
Well, I mean, in one sense, everyone's too valuable to die, and whether in the Gallipoli campaign of the First World War or the Second World War, hundreds and thousands and millions of very talented people in the sciences and the arts and business and politics lost their lives. And if you ever visit military cemeteries in Gallipoli or Normandy, one thing that strikes and shocks is how very young they were. Often, mostly it was 27, but oftentimes you'll find graves of 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds. So lots of people are too valuable to die. That said, all of us are liable at some point to walk into a set of situations where we are obliged to put our lives at risk. In my melodramatic moments, I imagine myself on some perfectly ordinary day walking into a situation where maybe there's the stereotypical child drowning in the lake, or there's an old man being beaten by thugs, and I imagine myself having to intervene at risk, and everyone faces that, and in wartime that afflicts millions of people. So in that sense, we're all too valuable to die, but sometimes we have to put ourselves at risk.
Liz?
I would take a slightly different angle. I would entirely agree that in terms of personal significance, everyone is too valuable to die. You leave behind relatives, family, colleagues, and so on, who will be distraught by your life, the loss of life and by your death, as Harry's mother and his sister were. Indeed, from a social perspective, also completely the same. And indeed, from a potential, it's hard to argue, which way someone's potential will be achieved, either during wartime or indeed afterwards. However, if one thinks in terms of practical terms, then I would argue some people are too valuable to die. In wartime, you do what you can, and the military and the government have to make some very difficult choices about who stays behind and who goes to war. So you have, for example, protected professions, engineers, farmers, and so on. And in World War I, scientist was not a protected profession at the beginning. By the end of the war, it was, at least informally, and then obviously during World War II, you have scientists working in places like Bletchley Park, working on the radar project, working on the Manhattan Project. So in some cases, the government and the military has to make some very difficult choices, and they do have to argue that some are too valuable to die.
Can I just ask, in the First World War, were there reserved occupations? There were in the Second. My father was a farmer, and he was in reserved occupation.
Yes, there were reserved
occupations. But not for scientists.
Yes, there's an interesting example in the Institution of Engineering and Technology archives in London of a chap who was in charge of the lighting for Newcastle Harbour, and he argued again and again and again that he wanted to go and do his bit on the front, and again and again and again. His supervisors, the government, and so on, and the military would back and say, "You are far more use in terms of the impact your life will have on shipbuilding in Newcastle than you could ever have on the battlefield."
And am I right in thinking that Moseley himself volunteered in 1914 against the pleas of his parents, and that the army was reluctant to take him? I read that somewhere.
That's not entirely. The Royal Engineers were reluctant to take him because he wasn't a professional engineer, not because the army was reluctant to take him. It wasn't necessarily against the wishes of his mother, but it was against the wishes of his supervisor, Ernest Rutherford, who thought he could be put to far better use, putting his scientific research to military goals rather than, and also that he should be preserved for the scientific research he would conduct after the war.
So if there are certain protected professions, or if there are certain individuals which are too valuable to be sent to the front, should they be prevented, even against their will, to fight in the war?
Prevented by whom?
Prevented by government, prevented by their family, prevented by other scientists. Those of you who saw the exhibition know that Rutherford, Harry's supervisor, tried very hard to persuade him to stay behind. Of course, his family did the same. The Royal Society got involved. Should they be prevented from doing so?
They are prevented, and I would argue that they should be prevented. If individuals in government or indeed in the military feel that their lives are of better use away from the battlefield, then yes, they should. In an individual such as Harry, I hope you get a clear sense of his personality in the exhibition. He was a very stubborn individual. Rutherford advised him not to enlist. He went against that advice. Rutherford could not persuade him to stay behind and take a less active role in the military. He went behind his back and approached Glazebrook and others to try and persuade them that he was too valuable. So Glazebrook was in charge of the National Physical Laboratory and had a key role in government scientific relations during World War I, and other powerful figures who were scientists working for the government during the war. But by the time they had managed to wrangle some kind of special concession for Harry, Harry was off in Gallipoli and shortly afterwards was killed.
Now Harry, because of his upbringing, of course felt very strongly that he should do his bit. Nigel, what are your feelings there? Should he, what are your thoughts? Should he have been prevented against his will?
Well, I think it's quite natural in those circumstances when all your friends and maybe relatives are risking their lives to feel cowardly at keeping yourself safe. My own father was a farmer, he was in a reserved occupation, he didn't have to fight, but in 1943 he volunteered and went off to Italy to fight. I never asked him why he did it, but I can only assume that he felt he couldn't live with himself at the end of the war if he hadn't exposed himself. And I don't know, but I imagine Moseley must have felt very similar.
Yes, he definitely expressed patriotic sentiments to him. From what we've read of his letters, he wouldn't even have, it wasn't even a choice. not in a sort of negative way, but very much in a positive way. He had an almost unquestioning duty to his God and his country, and he would have gone off. And to my mind, yes, he probably should have been kept behind, but I would like to see the individual who would have kept him behind, because I don't think he would have found a way to enlist and to fight. I have no doubt of it.
But in terms of the state's priorities,
yes.
It makes sense for certain people not to be exposed. And there's a reason why generals tend not to man their front lines. So, as it were, in terms of military efficiency, the state has good reason to keep certain people behind.
You were talking, Nigel, about the feeling many of that generation had, and that they felt they should do their bit when others were doing their bit. So should they have a moral or patriotic duty to risk their lives, even if they could be used somewhere else much better?
Well, generally speaking, whether they have a moral duty does depend on the nature of the war. I mean, there are such things as unjust wars, and sometimes we can know they're unjust, in which case no one has a duty. Some people don't believe that any war is just. I happen to think that some can be. And so if you have reason to think that a war is justified, then at first sight you have a moral duty to do your bit. However, in modern wars, there are all sorts of different roles, and some might just be so important that it makes very good sense for you to stay behind the front line. Lots of people have to do that.
You talked about just wars or a just cause. I'm sure that is something which is very close to the heart of our audience. What makes a war just? What is a just cause?
Well,
and from which side are we looking?
Well, in terms of how one makes decisions, some of the main criteria have to do with whether there's a grave injustice that needs rectifying, and whether in going to war that's what you're planning on doing. Sometimes injustice is best tolerated, but we can all think of cases where injustice looks intolerable, and then the question arises as to whether the resort to force of arms is justified. It's always risky, because whenever you start fighting, you never know how much damage it will cause or how long it will last. But when you're faced with really gross injustice, that's a dilemma we're all faced with.
Mm-hmm. So, in this context, in the context of the exhibition, Liz, the exhibition is of course also portraying the Ottoman side, the Gallipoli conflict, talking about losses on the Turkish side, as we would now call it. Just? Which side was just?
In the context of the Gallipoli campaign, I would say the Turkish side had more justification on their side. They were defending their homeland. Yes, you could argue that they were defending their people, their homes, their families, and so in that regard, they were more justified. If you take a step back and think of the larger picture and their position in World War I as an ally of Germany, that's perhaps a slightly more complex area of examination, given that particularly of interest, as I'm sure many of you know, Turkey didn't initially, well, the Ottoman Empire did not initially get involved at the very outbreak of war, but waited approximately a month before joining on the side of the Germans. So the Ottoman Empire's involvement in the war is a slightly more complex one, which I think you could see both sides and whether it's justified or not, but in terms of the Gallipoli campaign, they are entirely justified in defending their homeland.
Nigel, you are a specialist on just causes and just war. How would you respond to that?
Well, since the centenary of the opening of the First World War fell in 2014, there's been lots of debate among historians as to quite where the blame lies for the start of the war and the escalation of the war. And I think historians are less inclined to think that Germany was solely responsible. But the blame gets spread to Belgrade, it gets spread particularly to St. Petersburg. And you know, the First World War was very complicated, the different bits to it. My own reading of the narrow question of whether Britain should have got involved hinges quite narrowly on the justification or lack of it for the German invasion of France. And my only reading of that is it wasn't justified because there was no provocation. And that under those circumstances, Britain was morally obliged, or not legally obliged, but morally obliged to aid the French. Mm-hmm. And then things escalated from there. And for reasons we don't have to go into, Turkey at a certain point decided to ally itself with Germany. And that's why you have French and Irish and British and Australian troops on the shores of Gallipoli in Turkey.
There was a lot of criticism of the Gallipoli campaign right from the outset. There was strong advice against it. Nevertheless, the campaign started first as a naval campaign, then as a land campaign. We are often asked, should individuals who saw what was happening on the ground have objected against it, those who went to Gallipoli? Is that their role? Can that be their role?
Well, if only individuals could see what we see, because when you're in the midst of things, you can't see much. There's one moment in the Battle of Gallipoli where the Allies have been launching attacks on the Turks, and they've lost 6,000 people, and they stop. After the war, it came to light from German and Turkish sources that had the Allies tried one more time, they were broken through. But you can't see. So that everyone's operating in a fog, and what people can see is really quite limited. So I think we need to be forgiving of people who give the war benefit of doubt because they don't have enough reason to protest. But in terms of Gallipoli itself, I mean, the idea was Churchill's, and to view it a bit charitably, the aim was to circumvent the stalemate on the Western Front. So you've got the Western Front is stuck with opposing armies in trenches, and the war was stuck. And the idea was to march up Gallipoli, take Constantinople, knock Turkey out of the war, and imbalance things. So the idea was quite imaginative, but the execution left a lot to be desired.
And the idea was, of course, immediately criticised.
Yes. It was criticised by high-level staff of the Admiralty, where Churchill was First Lord, hence the fact that his idea was being executed. And I entirely agree that it was an imaginative idea, but one which I believe, given the resources that could be committed to it at the time, and their complete underestimation of the Turkish forces, their fighting ability, and for example, the German artillery knowledge that they had access to, I don't believe it was ever fully achievable. One angle which I think is perhaps an interesting one to pursue is that actually the death rate during the Gallipoli campaign, sort of per, let's say, 100,000 soldiers committed to it on both sides, was lower than that on the Western Front. But in the overall scheme of things, I don't believe the objective was achievable, even though the initial idea was brilliant, with resources committed to the Western Front and with the conflict on the Eastern Front as well. I don't believe that it was a military campaign that it could achieve success. I find it quite interesting, though, that historians have argued since that Churchill has been viewed quite favourably, and that of his sort of 10 major decisions and campaigns, he's only ever had 3 successful ones, but one of them was essentially World War II, so he's readily easily forgiven. But it is said on the 5th of June 1944, he was kept awake by the fear, the heart-stopping fear that D-Day would be a second Gallipoli. So the impact continued on.
So the military chiefs at the time were doubtful that enough resources would be put into this to make it work.
Well, they were doubtful of the resources, but they were also doubtful of the execution. So there were a number of high-level Admiralty staff who recommended that Churchill did not do this, and particularly in terms of after the initial failure of the initial naval campaign, the idea to have a second land-sea campaign was also advised against, but not in sufficient numbers to actually have impact on the overall decision. It was one of these campaigns where the reward they felt was worth the risk. So the reward of taking ransacking Constantinople, taking Turkey out of the war, and opening up a Russian supply route into the Mediterranean was sort of so big, the promise, that they would do almost anything to achieve it, take almost any risk.
Yes, I guess it just seems to me that war is about taking risk, and with the benefit of hindsight, we now know that the Turks were stronger than they were supposed to be, but in terms of guesstimating how strong the Turks would be, and the desire somehow to break the slogfest in northern France, I guess I can sympathise with those who are inclined to take the risk. But I gather that there are kind of practical absurdities, like Hamilton, who was the British commander, didn't get his staff out there until a couple of weeks before the landings happened, and so the time for detailed planning was very short. Yes. Is that right?
Yes, and there was a number of major problems with, even if they could get the resources out there, landing the supplies, under artillery fire and so on, was immensely problematic, and quite a few of the supplies that they had in place, systems in place they had, were not suitable for the topography and just the general, environment of Gallipoli. I mean, for example, Harry, as I'm sure many of you know who've seen the exhibition, was a signals officer. He was using telephone cables suited for the heavy mud of the Western Front on the sandy, dry landscape of Gallipoli, deeply unsuited. The issue of water supply was a major problem. There are examples in the British Army, at least, of Royal Engineers who won Victoria Crosses because they developed new ways to extract and purify water. During some stages of the campaign, soldiers were limited to half a pint of water a day in an arid, dry landscape at the height of summer. The losses due to disease, dysentery, and so on was perhaps more than actually due to the combat itself.
Yes, and on that point, we were talking earlier, and I was saying that 10 years ago I visited Gallipoli, as you have, and stumbled across, not far from the landing beaches, 2 huge concrete systems, which it turns out were built by engineers to contain water they shipped in from Egypt, because there was no water on the peninsula.
Which was the case for both sides, of course.
For both sides?
There was no water for either side. The Turkish side suffered equally, and probably worse, because they did not have the supplies by boat. Now, we've spoken about the too valuable to die. As you've already mentioned, Liz, that there was at least one positive outcome, if one can call it that in the Second World War attitude had changed, that scientists or specialists were used in different circumstances. We have mentioned Bletchley Park, not far from here, the use of mathematicians and very fine minds in code breaking. Many of you will have seen Imitation Game, the film about Alan Turing. Is that an entirely positive thing, or are those who are kept behind in some ways condemning others to death because somebody else needs to take their place?
Well, this is where my utilitarian approach may come to the fore. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, the philosophical construct of utilitarianism is that 10 lives saved is better than 6 lives. For example, you don't take into account the quality or, I suppose, value of those lives. And I would say, in the overall scheme of things, as is the accepted historic interpretation, Bletchley Park saved lives, or at least it saved Allied lives during World War II. And in the overall scheme of things, it's argued that it shortened World War II by 2 years. It's quite a number of, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives saved. Having said that, those who served in Bletchley Park, if they didn't go off to fight, someone else did in their place. But their life was of more value to the state, to the military, to their country, in terms of saving other lives. They also did have to make some very difficult decisions with the information that they had. So I'm sure many of you are familiar, but Enigma, or Ultra as was sometimes known, the information from that was released in very, very limited fashion to the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and in a very selective fashion You can read, for example, the Enigma headlines at Bletchley Park Archive, which reveals when sometimes this information from Enigma decrypts was made available more generally. Basically, Churchill gave them hell. But they had to make difficult decisions about when to release that information so that they wouldn't reveal that they were breaking Enigma at the time. And so, yes, lives were lost because they kept Enigma and Ultra a secret.
So scientists were to some extent put in the position of playing God by using statistics to decide how much information could they release to make sure that the other side would not realize that the code had been broken. The old debacle, is it justified to kill, the famous case of the English judge who had to judge over the captain, 4 people who were lost at sea. 3 of those had decided to kill the youngest of them because they needed to survive. In this case of cannibalism, the judge needed to decide, was that justified? Now, being in a position like that, is that a just war?
If I can steer clear of cannibals from
A wise move.
Yes, I mean, in a just war, you want to overcome an unjust enemy as efficiently and as quickly as possible, because war is very destructive, and because a just war has to aim at a viable peace. But while you're fighting the war, you need to find the most efficient ways of making the enemy stop. And there's no doubt that Bletchley Park and other scientists will have played a vital part in aiding the Allied war effort. The Second World War lasted 4 years, it could have lasted much longer. And so those who can aid, in particular the justified side, to win fast, are to be commended for doing that. And that may require them to be kept out of harm's way, as they were. And particularly in modern warfare, where what you're fighting with is highly technological, if you don't preserve your scientists, you'll lose.
But what kind of decision is it to, and what huge responsibility to put on the shoulders of those scientists to make the decision?
So which decision is this?
The decision of how much knowledge about the code breaking can be released, knowing full well that a whole convoy might be blown up because it would be too obvious to save it.
Yes.
Slightly. The decision wasn't just made by scientists, it was made by, for example, those in the intelligence service and also serving military officers. And indeed, most of the decisions would have been made by the intelligence service and military officers. Scientists were rarely involved in that decision-making process.
So,
I suppose the famous case of was it Coventry, when I don't know whether it was through Bletchley Park that we knew there was a bombing raid coming, but in order not to reveal the fact that we knew and how we knew it, the bombing raid was allowed to continue. So it's that kind of dilemma, and then there were probably others with convoys as well. So how does one make sense of that morally? Well, here's one way. You may not buy it. Here's one way. But what matters is intention. So in deciding not to use intelligence to stop the enemy from bombing your own people, it's not that you intend your own people to be killed. The intentional killing is done by the enemy. But you have strong reason, in this case, not to act to protect your people. I mean, it is a moral responsibility, and it must be an awful responsibility to bear. But there can be strong reason to do it. And if I'm in that position, I need to remind myself again and again and again, it wasn't me dropping the bombs.
if I may bring the discussion back to Moseley, it is often said that Moseley would have gone on to do great things in science, and that his research would have had positive impact had he survived Gallipoli. One could, of course, also say, had he survived Gallipoli, would his research have contributed to chemical weapons? Would it have contributed to the development of the atomic bomb in the 1930s, making it available to dictators earlier than it was available?
Yeah, so I talked about the importance of scientists in the war effort. Whether scientists should contribute to the war effort depends upon whether the war effort is justified or not. Oftentimes it's very hard for people to judge whether going to war is justified. But to take the example of Werner Heisenberg, who was involved in the German attempts to build, I think, atomic weapons. Mm-hmm. I don't know the story of Heisenberg well enough, but if we think that he could and should have known that the Nazi war effort was unjustified, then it follows that he should not have cooperated. But I don't know to what extent we can blame him for understanding the nature of the war he was supporting. But as you've just said, Moseley wouldn't have been faced with that dilemma, but he would have been faced, perhaps, with the question of whether to help in the development of chemical weapons, which were used by both sides in the First World War. But he was spared that.
So, Liz, what are the ethics of scientists putting their skill at the disposal of the war effort?
Well, I suppose I find it an interesting point about, I guess, that it comes down to whether something is a justified war or not. I'd be interested to probably ask you about this afterwards, about whether you think World War I is a justified war from all perspectives or not. So therefore, are chemical weapons developed by the Germans abhorrent, but chemical weapons developed by the British totally fine? That I think is an interesting dilemma. I think you brought up the instance of chemical warfare, and I suppose the case to which I must refer is that of Fritz Haber, who I'm sure many of you will know developed the first chemical weapons, released chlorine gas at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. He was there to witness it. His first wife committed suicide when she found out what he'd done. Other members of his family also killed themselves as well when they discovered what he'd done. And he's known as the father of chemical warfare. And so we would say, he's German, chemical weapons, he's a bad guy. The Fritz, or the Haber-Bosch process, is used to feed 50% of the world's population at the moment. It's a process for producing fertilizer. So you could say, if you took a utilitarian approach, then in the overall scheme of things, he had a more positive impact than he did a negative impact. So I would argue that science, perhaps this is a slightly naive idea, is neither good nor bad. It's how it's put to use. So his research was put to use developing fertilizers, but his research was also put to use developing chemical weapons. These things are more complicated than they appear.
That makes sense. But just to respond to your point there about chemical weapons perhaps being good if used by the guys with the white hats and not good if used by the guys with the black hats. I should explain that according to just war reasoning, one question is whether one should go to war at all and stay in it, but there's a separate question as to the means you use in fighting the war. And even if your cause is just, and even if your intention is right, there are certain means you may not use. And this brings in the principle of discrimination. You're not allowed to target non-combatants. And the reason for that is at least to limit the amount of damage you do. You can't target non-combatants. And so that raises a question about weapons that appear to be, whose effects appear to be difficult, if not impossible, to control. So if you release gas, you can't control where it goes. It can blow into a town as much as into the enemy troops. So it could be argued that chemical weapons are intrinsically indiscriminate and therefore may not be used. And I suppose that's I don't know the history of the negotiations that led to the convention to ban chemical weapons, but I imagine it's something along those lines.
Yeah, a lot of it had to do with the developments during World War I.
Okay.
So where are scientists in this? Where's the responsibility? Is it enough to say, I only developed it, somebody else dropped it?
Well, I mean, there's a kind of empirical question as to whether the scientist knows what he's doing the work for. And again, I don't know the history, but I watch television. If any of you saw the rather good several-part Norwegian series Saboteurs that Channel 4 broadcast earlier this year, it was about the attempt to blow up the heavy water plants in Norway.
We actually have an example from that right here. Right? We have a heavy water sample at the case right there.
Oh, excellent.
And that was taken from Norway by Saboteurs. So third case back from the front, right at the front of the case. So yes, excellent connection.
It didn't even prompt me. So that was about the development of heavy water and of Heisenberg was in Berlin using this stuff to develop atomic weapons. The Germanization implies that Heisenberg knew what it was for, to obliterate British cities. But I don't know how accurate that was. But if he knew that, that should have raised some moral qualms from my point of view.
Is it just to know what it is being used for, or is it also to know what might be used for? So where's the responsibility of the scientist? I suppose what I'm aiming for is it was only an order. Is that good enough?
No, it's never good enough. But the extent to which one individual's responsibility extends to the uses other people put something to, I mean, it depends really on questions of certainty. I mean, do I know what you're going to do with it? So I guess I'm thinking now of the Allied scientists involved in developing atomic weapons. I guess they knew what it was going to be used for, did they? But it's very difficult because if the enemy like Hitler is trying to develop atomic weapons, what do you do? Do you not develop them in response? I think I don't find it myself able to say no, you shouldn't. But I suppose you might develop them not with the intention of using them militarily, but with the intention of a deterrent, which Lord knows better that the world had never developed these things at all. But if someone develops them, it raises the questions as to how other people respond. It's very difficult.
Well, I think this also comes back to the interesting discussion of whether nuclear weapons are, good in the hands of the guys with the white hats, bad in the hands of the guys with the black hats, which I find an absolutely fascinating argument. To my mind, yet again, it comes back to more practical concerns. If your scientific research is located within what we would refer to now as the military-industrial complex, then you know that there is potential military application, that you are developing your scientific research towards military goals, be that in wartime or indeed outside of wartime, or indeed outside of more traditional wartime, such as the Cold War. However, I don't think it's a reasonable suggestion to scientists to know every possible outcome of their research. I think I suppose to my mind, it's not a black and white case, but perhaps a spectrum.
No, I agree with that. I think individuals have limited responsibility, and I take the point about it was only orders, and one has a responsibility for knowing certain things if one can. But having said that, if you decide to use what I've developed, the primary responsibility is yours, not mine. So I think it's fair to say, provided as it were the ultimate uses are uncertain to the scientists, and provided there are legitimate uses that are conceivable, then proceeding with the scientific research is morally okay, I think.